So just a few words at the start about why hydrogen for transport, a few words on the technical with respect to some of the key challenges with hydrogen as a fuel, then a few words on the status of political support for hydrogen around the world and the kind of investments that have been given to hydrogen technology, and finally I'll wrap up with some conclusions about where it might all be going. So I think we've probably covered most of these issues earlier on in the day, but it's just worth seeing them all together. Hydrogen transport, if the hydrogen is sourced from a sustainable source, offers CO2-free transport. Perhaps equally importantly, it offers a diversity of potential energy sources, which is a way of adding robustness and security to our energy supply. And it's a big driver, certainly for the US hydrogen activities, avoiding dependence on a single geographical location, such as the Middle East. You've got then other advantages which people don't talk about as much because they're perhaps not sort of tangible at the moment, but virtually noiseless cars has a profound effect on the way we look at our cities. People will also talk about an equivalent or better driving experience because of the way that you can distribute fuel cells around vehicles and, of course, moving to electric propulsion. And then finally, the local pollution issue, which is emissions so clean that you can drink them, and that's Ragioma, the BBC correspondent, drinking the emission from a fuel cell bus at the top there. And so in response to the sort of the potential of the technology, nearly all have got their own major development programs. But the real question is, when is it going to be commercial? When are we actually going to be able to see this on the streets? Hopefully try and answer some of those questions. Let me just pick out a couple of these. I hope it's going to work, or later. This one is the most recent Honda FCX vehicle, and this vehicle from GM, GM Sequel. They're probably the two most advanced vehicles, very much designed around the fuel cell drivetrain. This GM Sequel vehicle recently drove 300 miles in standard traffic conditions on a single tank of hydrogen, which is a fairly major achievement, seeing as 300 miles is considered the acceptable range to operate. The other one you'll be aware of, hopefully most of you saw the Citaro fuel cell operating in London. 3 buses operated for a period of 3 years and gained substantial public support, hence the picture by the Mayor's office. But perhaps more interesting is this bus here, which is from Van Boel, where they deployed a hybrid drivetrain, and the vehicle actually more than doubles the fuel economy of a standard diesel bus. And I guess the final thing to point out is this one here, which is one of the early niches. You'll notice Toyota there. Nearly all of the forklift OEMs are developing fuel cell product because it's seen as a very, very key early market for hydrogen fuel cells, where you're replacing lead-acid batteries with a lot of problems they have in indoor warehousing applications. I won't talk about this for very long, because I think I agree with everything Martin said earlier. Fuel cells are the main focus, and the main reason for that is their efficiency. It's as simple as that. They convert energy electrochemically, avoid the Carnot losses that are inherent in an internal combustion engine, and as a result offer you a more efficient driving opportunity. Of course, you can also modify an internal combustion engine to operate on hydrogen. BMW are perhaps the most famous protagonist of this. They've brought out 7 Series using hydrogen. It being a heavy 7 Series and also using the less efficient internal combustion engine, they've been forced to move to a liquid hydrogen onboard store, which means storing hydrogen at minus 253 degrees C in sort of space vessels. And there you can see the reason why most manufacturers have pushed towards a fuel cell solution, because they've improved the efficiency of the vehicle and avoided the need to go for very expensive hydrogen storage technologies. This is a slightly complicated slide, but I hope it's worth it. Oops. Sorry. There you go. With a company called E4Tech and also Owen Lee's Energy for the DTI, and sort of helping them to write their long-term hydrogen strategy. What it shows is a range of energy chains in 2030, making a series of what you'd probably call optimistic but realistic assumptions about where hydrogen might be and all the other energy chains might be in 2030. So what we've got is we're comparing everything to a gasoline baseline, a conventional gasoline drivetrain, and all of the emissions from well to wheel in terms of grams per kilometre. And what we've got on the x-axis is the cost in terms of pounds per tonne of CO2 avoided relative to that gasoline baseline. And then the amount of CO2 saved in percentage terms relative to that gasoline baseline. So a whole range of energy chains in terms of both cost and also their overall carbon saving potential. And if we just start with some of the non-hydrogen chains that you can see here, we've got a natural gas internal combustion engine, which is perhaps even, its efficiency benefits give you a slight CO2 benefit and may even give you some cost benefits by the time you get to 2030. Gasoline hybrid here, again, the advantages of hybridization give you a 20 to 30% CO2 reduction, but that comes at a fair penalty because the additional battery cost is fairly high in that situation. And there are batteries there which are offering a 50% CO2 cut, even on today's grid mix. Obviously, if you move to a zero carbon electricity system, that would go higher up. But the cost is high, and that's because the cost of batteries. We'll talk a bit more about batteries later, I promise. Now moving to the sort of hydrogen chains, we've got a couple of hydrogen chains that you just really aren't very interested in at the bottom here. If you go from coal to hydrogen and don't bother to do anything about the CO2, you may, because of the efficiency of the fuel cell, you may make a small CO2 saving on here, but the cost is very high, and essentially the benefits are worthless. You'd have made a whole transition to another technology for no real CO2 benefit. And likewise here we see converting natural gas to hydrogen and then burning it in a hydrogen internal combustion engine. Whilst we make the CO2 saving equivalent to gasoline hybrid, it comes at a big price, and effectively the relative inefficiency of an internal combustion engine doesn't justify the use of this in the long term as a sort of a big sort of nationwide energy chain. Now, if we turn our attention to the hydrogen change with fuel cells at the end, where we're getting the efficiency benefits of the fuel cells in vehicles, you can see natural gas sequester the CO2 already makes you of the order of a 40% CO2 cut. So that includes as well-to-wheel emissions, so that's including the efficiency hit in the reformers that were mentioned earlier. The second sort of group of technologies is the coal and natural gas, including some form of carbon capture and storage, so you're burying the carbon underground in some form or another. And then finally up at the top, we see the pretty zero carbon hydrogen routes, and you've got biomass-derived hydrogen, wind-derived hydrogen, or nuclear-derived hydrogen. And also up there you can see two of the chains that we've just spoken about, ethanol and Fischer-Tropsch diesel, also featuring up there from biomass routes, and obviously they don't have any hydrogen in them. There probably should be all sorts of error bars on these numbers, but they give you an idea of where we might be going with the various technologies. And what you can see on a slide like this is, to a certain extent, you can see the transition pathway that would get you to zero carbon hydrogen. You could, for those early vehicles, 1% of the total stock, you could do all the natural gas hydrogen, still make a CO2 saving, and be preparing the way for either a carbon capture and storage based system using our remaining hydrocarbon reserves, or eventually moving to either a renewable or a nuclear hydrogen system. Of course, the cost is still expensive, but it's worth pointing out that this is at $25 a barrel, which is what the DTI asked us to use. If you move to a $50 a barrel situation, using obviously these positive assumptions about what's going to happen to the technology, you can see that biomass, wind and nuclear all group around the origin here, suggesting that you're pretty much achieving these carbon savings at no additional cost. This is obviously assuming that all the infrastructure has been put in and properly amortized. And then finally, batteries, just making the point again that low carbon electricity would push you into push batteries into the mix for totally zero carbon transport. Now, so I think the point I would make on this slide is just that there's at least 6 routes to zero carbon transport or very low carbon transport through hydrogen. You've got wind and photovoltaics, renewable electricity, electrolyzing water and generating hydrogen, nuclear hydrogen through direct thermochemical processes or again high temperature electrolysis. You've got coal as a source of energy with carbon capture and storage, natural gas, preferably with carbon capture and storage, biomass, probably through a gasification process, and then a whole suite of novel technologies that are under active research at the moment: photoelectrochemical, biological fermentation, photosynthetic, and even high temperature solar dissociation. And it's that diversity of sources which to me is a very important component of hydrogen argument, which is that that gives you the energy security that you want, as well as the potential for CO2 reduction through the growth chain. Oops, sorry. But of course, that was in 2030 using a series of key assumptions. And I think that the next step obviously is to explore those key assumptions and wonder how close we are to getting near to hitting some of those key assumptions. The big issues are probably those 4 there: cost, hydrogen storage, refueling infrastructure and its deployment, and component lifetime. I think what I'd like to do is just touch on each of them in turn on the next slide. So I think Martin got the whole sort of fuel cell cost thing correct, which is that we are within spitting distance on cost and durability of fuel cell technology. What I'm showing here On this graph here, you probably can't see the scale too well, is Ballard, one of the leading fuel cell developers, cost projections going forwards. What they do is every year to convince their shareholders to continue investing in them, is they get an independent auditor to suggest what the manufacturing cost if they make 500,000 units of their cell stacks would be. And you can see there you've got a cost of the order of $120 per kilowatt in 2002. And that's already fallen, just through core technology developments, down to the order of $60 a kilowatt in 2005. And that continues to improve. And down at the bottom we've got the DOE, which is sort of aggregating all of the fuel cell development in North America. And you can see the DOE targets. The target is in 2015 that you'll have $30 a kilowatt fuel cell stack. In 2002, it was costing $275 a kilowatt, again, assuming this volume manufacture has begun. And then between 2002 and 2006, just core stack technology improvements reduced that cost to $107 a kilowatt. And we're seeing a similar thing in durability. In 2003, we were at about 1,000 hours. The 2006 status, according to the DOE, is about 2,000 hours. I would suggest that from projects that we're working on, anecdotal evidence, that number is actually already over 3,000 hours to the kind of numbers that fuel cell manufacturers are actually prepared to warranty. And then the eventual target in automotive applications is 5,000 hours. But just worth noting that is really for the passenger car. For buses and longer life vehicles, that needs to be higher. On hydrogen storage, on the other hand, I think it's fair to say that there's been no magic solution found. This is another one of these slightly complicated graphs, I hope are worth it. But what we have at the bottom here is the gravimetric capacity. So that's the amount of hydrogen stored per mass of the total storage container, the weight percent, which is the sort of people target these very magic weight percent numbers. But at the same time, it's also bearing in mind the overall volumetric capacity in terms of the amount of hydrogen that's stored per litre of fuel. And what is drawn on this graph, this is also from the Department of Energy, who have an excellent hydrogen program. The 2015 targets and the 2010 targets, and then the technologies that are actually available at the moment. And I'll just talk through them in turn. Probably worth starting with this learning demo here. These are vehicles that are actually in the field at the moment, so they probably don't represent today's best technology, but what they do is the most recent sort of attempt to put together a system. And you're seeing that we're getting 103 to 190 miles as standard in vehicle trials of the order of 50-odd vehicles. Are achieving sort of 103 to 190 miles, just based on pretty much exclusively on compressed hydrogen tanks. The next generation vehicles are about to be deployed on these trials, and we should expect these things to be moving incrementally to the right. If you then look at the actual technologies themselves and what their promise is, you see here 350 bar compressed hydrogen tanks. They would be composite tanks. The challenge would be to reduce the weight of the pressure vessel. And 700 bar tanks, which perhaps don't store as much, they give you volume savings. And then liquid hydrogen I mentioned on the BMW vehicle, where you're cooling to minus 253 degrees centigrade, fairly cool. And cryocompressed. And then you've got the big white hopes, I suppose, which are the various hydride technologies, what people have been referring to as solid state storage. And you can see that we're not there yet on these. The complex hydrides at about 2 weight percent, and chemical hydrides at about 4 weight percent. There are exotic compounds that are up here, but no one can work out how you'd possibly put them into an energy system at the moment, based on hydrogen. The other point I'd make here, someone's conveniently drawn on the battery current status and aspirations, and you can see the issue for battery technologies. They just don't have the weight percent or the volumetric percent to give you the energy equivalence that some of these hydrogen technologies give you, let alone today's state of gasoline and diesel vehicles. And what that means for battery vehicles is that you're always going to have to accept some form of compromise in either range or vehicle size or vehicle space in order to be able to operate them. I think that the proximity of the overall targets to where we are today illustrates the fact that there aren't huge numbers of promising chemistries available out there to get you to something equivalent to what we have today. Onto production and infrastructure. Again, these are now just targets, so these aren't what's actually achieved in the field. But what the DOE is doing is it's targeting for a whole range of different hydrogen production pathways, a bit like what I showed at the beginning. It's targeting cost reductions over time. And again, they're forced to make assumptions about the overall volume of hydrogen that's going through each of these production pathways. And you can see what they're doing is they're targeting a value of $3 per kilogram of hydrogen, and that makes it just about equivalent on a calorific basis to the cost of petrol before taxation. I would say that infrastructure probably presents the biggest hurdle now. I think that the fuel cell companies and to a certain extent the car companies have responded to the opportunity of hydrogen in a way that the infrastructure companies probably haven't. They probably haven't needed to be fair. To give you an illustration, we're working on a project in London at the moment to deploy a fueling station for 10 hydrogen buses, and that will be probably the largest in Europe. And that's just going to use natural gas reforming, so it's a fairly standard technology, on-site natural gas reforming, and that will produce hydrogen at approximately a cost of £10 a kilogram. That's to turning the $3 a kilogram into US pounds, you need to get to £1.50 a kilogram for it to happen. So there is still a substantial amount of work that's needed there. Some of the cost savings will come through scale, some of the cost savings will come through technology learning, and some of the cost savings will just come through things like being able to amortise the investment over a longer period once you trust the technology more. But there is still a substantial amount of work to be done on infrastructure, and I think it's fair to say that much, much less money has been invested in infrastructure than in the vehicle technologies for hydrogen. So just summarising the progress, I would say that the cost we will see when we get to volume manufacture what it is, but from a core technology basis it looks like significant progress has been made. Storage remains a problem, but you can drive a GMC for 300 miles using today's technology, compressed hydrogen in current traffic, in conventional traffic. So in other words, with maybe a couple of compromises on the vehicle, slightly smaller boot space for example, you can design vehicles that can operate and give you the range that you require using today's technology. Storage actually hits you twice if you don't get it right, because it also hurts on the infrastructure side, and actually it may be more of a problem on the infrastructure side, because without a very energy dense storage solution, it's difficult to imagine lugging hydrogen up and down the country, and it becomes a very big issue about exactly how you move hydrogen. And so a storage solution would perhaps be more useful from an infrastructure perspective than from the vehicle technology itself. And finally, infrastructure, I think I just mentioned how important I see the infrastructure issue. And the real key challenge is going to come around 2015, the date when people are trying to commercialise these vehicle technologies, where you have to marry a fairly substantial rollout in hydrogen refuelling infrastructure with obviously the mass manufacturing infrastructure that the vehicle manufacturers will need, volume-based cost reductions. And I would see that as a key challenge. So a few words on options other than hydrogen. Talking now about totally zero carbon transport solutions. I see that there are basically three. Biofuels, batteries and hydrogen. Biofuels we just heard an excellent speech on. It's clear that the current first generation technologies have all sorts of problems with them. And even for the second generation technologies there are technological issues. They're not there yet. The second generation technologies, and also resource issues which are still yet unresolved, I think it's fair to say. Batteries, I've been asked to speak about. I think you saw on the weight density graph what the issue is for batteries. They just don't have the same energy density of any of these other options. And so if batteries are going to become a mainstream technology, either some breakthrough is going to have to happen that we can't foresee, or people are going to have to accept a different type of driving experience with shorter range and more rapid refuelling, lighter vehicles. Think of the Riva electric vehicle, which is still in London running around to beat congestion charge. That's what's going to be required if we're going to make a wholesale transition to sort of zero carbon electricity and battery technologies. And hydrogen, hopefully I've just given an illustration of some of the issues with respect to hydrogen technologies. I think it's fair to say that at present all options must remain open from the perspective of getting to zero carbon hydrogen, and there are certainly uncertainties with all three of them. Just turning to the politics quickly, there's been substantial effort in this worldwide. Essentially the politicians have responded to the hype which Martin spoke about with a substantial number of programs. I suppose the activity is concentrated in the US and Japan, and they have very well structured programs. And also to a certain extent China, who are starting to throw a lot of money to their domestic auto companies to try and develop competitive fuel cell vehicles, mainly aimed at the domestic market. That speech there is George Bush's speech. And as George Bush quote, I believe that today's children will one day take their driver's test in a hydrogen-powered pollution-free car. It's a big goal, but it's an attainable goal. And that is that sort of spirit which is infusing the US program. They see it very much as a sort of Manhattan Project type effort. Japan has a slightly sort of structured program. What's interesting about both of the two programs is that they have cut-off dates. The US program aims to stop in 2015, and if you haven't achieved commercialization by 2015, that's tough. End of government handouts towards the technology. That's the idea, and we'll see what happens when we get there. In Europe, Europe's doing the European thing and trying to build a consensus. What they're trying to do is just a thing called the Joint Technology Initiative, which many of you will be familiar with, which is the idea being that public sector and private sector interests can sort of come together in a very, very large program to spend the money on the fundamental R&D, but also on the deployment and demonstration activities that are needed to get to 2015. As part of that, they have a sort of a set of technology aspirations which have been pretty much signed off by the EC, and you can read them there. R&D investment such that you get to commercially acceptable lifetimes and efficiencies by 2015. And also, I think the 2020 targets are perhaps more interesting, 1 to 5 million vehicles on EU roads by 2020, and something between 0.4 and 1.8 vehicles sold annually from 2020. The total transport component of that joint technology initiative is of the order of 2.6 billion euros. So we are talking about scale. So when will it happen? Well, what's clear is it'll enter in niches first, as all technologies do. I mentioned warehousing. Warehousing is very clearly one of the early markets for the transport technologies. The reason for that is that batteries in warehousing applications are heavy, take a long time to refuel, take up a lot of space for the refueling, run out of charges towards the end of a shift, and all sorts of other things which cause warehouse operators and factory operators all sorts of headaches. And hydrogen can avoid that, operate indoors and give you the sort of long life that you need. Perhaps the next niche is going to come in buses. Buses have the advantage of being basically public sector vehicles, so they're easy to stimulate in a public sector way. And also they return to base at night, so you can easily refuel them. Niche vehicles such as urban delivery vehicles will probably follow on from the buses and forklifting type models. The real question is over the major OEM deployments, the major car companies. I think it's fair to say that's uncertain, so they're using much easier technology that we pretty much have available today. The initial trials have been technically very encouraging. They've proved that you can do it, but there's still a lot of work to do on safety standards, codes, and also obviously on cost. I would say that the current challenges work. You can link mass deployment of vehicle manufacturing capacity with mass deployment of infrastructure, and that's an expensive undertaking. Between 2010 and 2020, we will see niches opening up for transportation solutions, and the real question is whether all the passenger cars come in behind them. And finally, the UK has a lot of catching up to do, as ever, if it's going to remain competitive in the area. Thank you very much.